Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. Thank you so much for tuning in with us again this week. If I don't say it enough, I just want you all to know how grateful I am that you share your stories with me and that you tune in to listen. And my deepest prayer always are that these stories are bringing you some measure of comfort if you are grieving. And if you are someone that is supporting somebody who's grieving, I hope that you're finding them helpful as well. This week, I'd love to introduce to you my guest, Judy Lipson. She is the founder and chair of Celebration of Sisters, an annual ice skating fundraiser established in 2011 to commemorate the lives and memories of her beloved sisters to benefit Massachusetts General Hospital. Judy has published articles, given speeches, and been interviewed by Open to Hope organization, the Centering organization, Skating Magazine, and in literature published by Massachusetts General Hospital, where she has maintained a close philanthropic relationship for more than 20 years. Her passion for figure skating secured her the United States Figure Skating Association 2020 Get Up Champion Award. So it is my deep pleasure, Judy, to welcome you to the Leap podcast. I have been looking forward to this conversation with you since we touched base many weeks ago. So welcome.
Thank you, Susan. I'm honored to be here with you today.
And I also, just before we start our conversation, I just want to hold up the beautiful cover of your memoir that Judy just released. This was released in November of last year. And it is a beautiful memoir that really is very raw, open, and honest about her own grief journey over the loss of her two very dear sisters, her younger sister, Jane, and her oldest sister, Margie. So welcome. I'd love to start with your story of your sisters. If you could just talk about what happened to your sisters, I think is probably the best place to start, just so that we're all on the same page before we jump into your grief journey would be really wonderful.
Yes, so I always say I'm the middle of three, and sadly I lost both my sisters, is how I address that today. So Jane was the youngest, 3 years younger than me, and tragically at age 22 in 1981, we lost her in a car accident. And 9 years later, in 1990, we lost my older sister, Margie, who was 2 years older than me, after a 20-year battle with anorexia and bulimia.
So I have been reading your memoir, and I think what struck me is everybody's grief journey is very, very different. And I always say there are no clocks or calendars. And that is also true when people begin their grieving process. For some people, it's immediate. For others, it's many years later. So I would love for you to be able to bring us into your world and your journey, because I know that yours was a bit delayed with these two incredibly horrific and tragic losses that you experienced in your own life. So I would love for you to share anything you want and where you begin in talking to us about your grief journey.
So when Jane died, I was 25 years old. So I had been living in New York and working for Bloomingdale's and in a career in retailing. And I had come home, and it was such a shock because Margie had been very, very ill. So to lose Jane was a total shock. So I had come home, and I wasn't even home a week. And my father sent me back to New York to go to work. So it was November, and it was the height of the retail Christmas season. So, that's like all hands on deck. Sales are contingent on the last 6 weeks. And I worked for a boss, and if I cried, I would have lost my job. And I remember, I think you describe it in your book too, that you're like having an out-of-body experience. Like you don't know, you're out of control. It's not yourself. I think you felt that after Rocky died. And I remember walking back into the office, and even the desk and chairs looked differently. Everything looked different. And I was always in control. And I started to shake and I started to cry. And thankfully, a nice coworker pulled me into his office, and I composed myself and I got it together. And I just kind of went through the motions. And here I was, 25 years old, by myself, and I didn't know what grief was. I didn't know what I needed, but I was in a fog for a long time. And my parents sent me to this therapist who sat there and scribbled notes and didn't even look at me. And I remember this vividly. My memory is so scattered. And then I just went on with my life and just was on like a treadmill, and just Margie's illness got obviously worse. And I stayed in New York, and then I came back to Boston, got married, had kids, and just kind of went on a treadmill of life. And just my grief got pushed down further and further and further and further. I mean, I would get waves of it. I'd be in the car and I'd start crying, or I'd think of something. It's not like it wasn't there, but it got pushed down for almost 30 years.
I could weep just listening to you. I mean, I imagine you at 25 years old, you were so young, got your whole life ahead of you. And I remember reading this in your memoir. Here you are in New York City, you've got your own apartment, you're working for Bloomingdale's. I mean, wow, that is just it's so thrilling to think about. Just to think about at that age that you were probably just on fire. And then all of a sudden, the carpet is pulled out from underneath you in this, tragic way. And I think that the other element of this, and of course, I have to look at this through my therapist's eyes, that you've got a very sick sister that probably your family had been concerned about for so long, right? Like it probably all eyes were focused on Margie and her eating disorder and how do we get her healthy. And so Janie dying was just so out of the blue. So I'm just curious, like, what was going on for your parents? I can imagine your father just wanted you to go back to your life to try to make things as normal as possible for you. But what was happening within the family unit, and what was going on with Margie? Like, I was trying to imagine what was happening for your family, and I would just love to hear your perspective of what was going on.
Right before Jane died, I had come home. It was my 25th birthday. And I was like, I had just gotten a promotion. I was like, I'm 25. I'm living in New York. I'm great. Everything is great. And we had all been together we had come home for a family wedding. So we get the call, and that's it. So Margie went south. She just got sicker and sicker and sicker and whatever. And I think my father tried to keep the family together. My mother, rightfully so, fell apart. And I was away. And I was away until I was, I think I stayed away a couple of years, and then I came back. Jane died in 81. I think I came home in like 86. So I was away for a few years. So I wasn't there to witness all of it. I stayed away a little for a couple of years.
Was that intentional, Judy? Did you stay away because it was just too much for
I
you?
had this job, and I was trying to, and then I got married and I had a child. But as soon as my child was born, I came back because I knew that they needed that. So I came back after my daughter was born. And then of course I wanted to quit my job. I became hysterical, and I called my father hysterical. So he's trying to keep the family together, take care of Margie's illness, take care of my mother. So he was trying to keep everybody together. And, I would come home when I could, but it was, and I got married, I think Jane died in 81. I got married in 83. So my mother planned the wedding, but I think it probably gave her something to do. But she was in rough shape.
So what was happening? Were you talking about it as a family? So you were away, but I'm imagining, did you come back on holidays? Did you talk to your parents? Did you guys have conversations? I mean, let me tell you what I'm feeling. What I feel is that this tragedy happened and nobody knew how to deal with it. So it was like this undercurrent. So when you were talking to your parents, was anyone talking about Janie?
No, they didn't. It was too painful for them. And so I guess part of it is I took the lead for them, and I didn't talk about it. So we just didn't talk about it. And, I can remember that coming home for that first Thanksgiving, and Thanksgiving used to be my favorite holiday, and we'd all be together, and we went to a restaurant, and Margie was not home, and the three of us just sitting there in a restaurant. And, of course, I'm trying to keep the conversation going because, and it was just horrible. We had gotten invitations, and then, friends or family would invite us, and it was just, nothing felt right, which I'm sure you felt afterwards. It's finding that comfort level of not normal anymore, and a new normal that doesn't quite work. And we just kind of punted along, but it was very strained.
And so painful. It's just so painful. I mean, I write about that in my book, that I didn't write about this part, though, about Thanksgiving. And it was interesting when you talked about Thanksgiving, because my brother's birthday is the 24th of November. So it was always around. And my other brother's the 22nd of November. So we would always have like candles and a pie or whatever at Thanksgiving for these two birthdays. And what struck me is that the first Thanksgiving after Rocky died, I just said, I'm not having Thanksgiving. I'm not cooking Thanksgiving. And we all went to a restaurant for the very first time. And like the last place you even want, when you just said nothing feels right, that's exactly it. It's so beautifully put. Nothing feels right. No place feels right. Nobody feels right. Nothing feels the same. It is an out-of-body experience. It's like you're standing there in your own life and you don't want to really be anywhere ever. Like you just, and what do you do in this new normal when nothing about it is normal? And you're so young and you've got another very sick sister. And what was going on with Margie when you said that was she in a inpatient facility, getting help for her eating disorder? Or was this also something that wasn't really talked about? It was just sort of the elephant in the room. What was happening with your sister?
Oh, yeah, she was in and out, but going down on a downward trajectory. So it was bad. And then, this was just, and I'm sure she felt, incensed that everybody thought it was her and not, that was going to be the one and not Jane. So, I mean, it was very hard.
So your sister dies, your other sister is very sick, and you're living your life, you get married, you have children. Did you put Janie out of your mind? Did you compartmentalize? When did the magnitude hit you of this loss? Was it when you lost your second sister? Talk to us about when things sort of, I want to say when the volcano erupted, because that's sometimes how grief feels to me.
Well, and then my kids were young. I got divorced, so I was a single parent. I was living near my parents, and I just did life, and I just kept going. And then it was, my dad got very sick and with terrible illness, and he was dying. So this is already almost 30 years later. And I knew that his loss was going to be tremendous. My best friend was dying of cancer, and I ran into each of the girls' friends after 30 years and met them. So were like all these signs that felt like, I've got to do this work. I've got to face this music. I've got to finally really deal with this grief. There was, not that it wasn't there. It's not that I didn't feel the grief. I'd see something, or I'd be in the car and I'd burst into tears. And of course, on the birthdays and the anniversaries, how you lead up when you feel off that whole week and you start crying and all that. And then the day comes and you're kind of like, what about this? Or the Jewish memorial service, I'd be in temple crying my eyes out, that finally I stopped going because I couldn't walk out. I was like a dish rag. So, there were signs. So all of these things finally happened at the 30-year mark that I felt like I have to do this work.
And so you said you lost your sister Margie. So she ended up passing as a result of complications from the eating disorder.
Yes.
Now, remind me, had your father died at that point? I can't, was it after? No. Oh,
No,
sorry. I already know this. He died after.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Margie died. Yeah. And so what happened after that second death within your family?
Again, there was no talk about it. And it was kind of like, for me, it was very strange because as the middle child, I was sort of the one that got the least focused. And I was kind of, in the wings the whole time. So now that, who am I now? Am I an only child? Like, what does this mean? And that, not that all the focus was on me, but it was like centered around me and mainly my children, but like on me. It was very strange. And I didn't know who I was, and I just tried to be the daughter for three. And it was a lot of pressure. And I felt that I had to bring life and happiness to my parents. And, mainly through my daughters, that I had to be there for them and always, kind of be the daughter for three, even though it was just me.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard that a lot, especially when there are two, right? I mean, I don't know anybody who's lost two siblings. Oh no, that's not true. There was somebody in my book that I interviewed that had lost two siblings, but I did interview people who only had one survive. There was only two of them to begin with, and feeling like they had to fill the shoes of their sibling who died. And I wondered, that it wasn't brothers. You had two sisters. There were three of you. And with losing both of your sisters, you were losing your friends, right? I mean, that friendship within a family where you're going to grow old together, you're going to raise your children together, you're going to take care of your ailing parents together. I mean, all the things that we think about, because it seemed to me that the three of you were very close sisters as well when I was reading your book. What this illness that was happening with your sister after Janie died, did you and Margie, were you able to talk about things, or was her life so consumed with what was going on with her that there really was no room for your relationship as sisters? What was happening with that?
We never talked about it. I mean, as close as we were, even with her illness, we were still close. It's just something that we never talked about it. And it's too bad. And I think part of it is we took the lead from our parents, but also I think it was the time. It was the 80s. People just didn't talk about it. I think it was just a different way of life, and we just never talked about it.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. My brother just died. Well, it's been 8 years now, but I think it's grief. I mean, I wrote about this part, like, do I say my brother's name? When I think that in a family, we're trying to protect each other, right? And it's silly when you think about it, because siblings don't want to mention their deceased sibling's name because they're like, oh my God, I'm going to cause more pain to my parents, which is ridiculous because that's all they think about 24/7. And even as siblings, I found that we weren't mentioning my brother's name. And it wasn't until I started running these grief and loss groups that I really started to understand so much of the erroneous belief system around grief, right? That if we talk about it, if our friends bring it up, they're going to cause us more pain, when really we want to talk about our siblings, right? And you and I talked about this before we started recording, that siblings are typically the forgotten ones during grief because they're too busy trying to support the people around them, primarily the parents, or if the sibling is old enough to have a spouse and children, that we are left with this, like I said, this erroneous belief that somehow we have to be strong for everybody. But what are we supposed to do with our own grief? Because I found myself swallowing my grief and my pain when I was around my parents, and that I would wait to get home to do my crying. So I'm not sure if it's, is it really about the time, the 80s, the 90s, or really is it about grief? that it is one of those things that I feel like is still such a, I don't want to call it taboo. Go ahead and speak, because
But I think it's also everybody grieves differently. And I think each family member grieves differently, and nobody knows how to communicate within the family. And I think even among siblings in a family, people grieve differently. So it's a combination of what I mean about the times. I mean, it was like a taboo to talk about grief at the time. That's what I mean. And like a taboo to talk about mental illness, but also it's people don't know what they need, and they don't know how to communicate to each other within a family. And even amongst, if there's a sibling loss and there's two other surviving siblings, sometimes those two siblings don't even know how to communicate with each other about grief.
exactly. Yeah. And that was,
I think that's the issue, because again, can we talk about it? Can we not talk about it? You know, I may want to cry today. You may not want to cry today. So there's, again, like I said, there's no recipe for grief. And even in families, even among siblings who lost a sibling within a family, how you deal with it and how I deal with it may not jive or be on the same page. So, and if you don't talk about it, how are you going to know what the other one needs or the other one feels?
so you said your dad was sick. Was he the trigger for you at this 30-year mark that you finally said, I don't want to say gave into, because it sounds like, you were doing your life, but talk to us about that 30-year mark.
Well, I knew, because he was kind of like the rock and the anchor that was holding the family together. So I knew that it was going to be a tremendous loss and another loss. And, coupled with this, my best friend was dying. So he died in 2011. She died in 2013. So it was like, and all these losses. And I just, I'd been to therapists, and they kept saying, you really need to do this grief work, because, listen, as we know, it impacts other areas of our lives. We can't make it go away. It impacts us, right? So it was just, and then I ran into one of Margie's friends Margie'd been sick for 20 years and gone for 20 years. And she said to me, I want to talk to you about Margie. And I just right away, my knee-jerk reaction, because, I had built up this big wall. I said, no. And then I thought about it, and I said, you know what? What's this about? I really should talk to her. And she told me that Margie changed her life. And I just was, that the fact that Margie was still remembered and still in this girl's heart.
I read that in your book, and I know.
I couldn't believe. And then I ran into one of Jane's friends. So it was like all these signs were telling me that, you know what, it's time. And so I did it. And then I decided to form the fundraiser. So it was.
But let's slow down when you say you did it. This sort of gets at the heart of the matter, because I'm going to tell you how I felt when I was reading this. You had a sister, 22 years old, it was her birthday, wasn't it? Did she die on her birthday?
The next day, yeah.
The next day. And I remember reading that nobody was really telling you the circumstances around her death or how she got into the accident. You got a police report, and you read that it was an excess of speed that caused the accident. And then, of course, your Margie died of this eating disorder. Did you go through a rageful period when you were just mad at your sisters during the grieving? Did anger ever come up for you? I just really want to hear when you said I did it, meaning the grief work. It had to have been so layered for you. And so for listeners and myself, I would love to hear what that work was. What was that like for you?
It's kind of like when I make a decision, I just have to do it. I don't think I was ever angry, believe it or not. I think I was just, I think it was so surreal to me, the whole thing. I think I just couldn't believe the whole thing. Like, oftentimes I would just say, is this my life? More than anger, it was, I just couldn't believe, like, this is my life more than anything else.
And so when you said that you did the grief work, did you do that alone? Did you do that in a group? Did you continue to see,
Well,
did you start seeing a therapist again? What did you do?
well, after my father died, I went to a group about people who had lost parents. And I think that sort of started the ball rolling. And then the woman started me and she said, you should start to write and start to tell your story. So I think that kind of snowballed into, I think I really need to do the work. And, so I think that was kind of the impetus that got me going.
So, I wrote my dissertation when I got my MFA. I wrote my dissertation on the therapeutic benefits of writing through grief and loss. I worked with kids who experience intense trauma in the juvenile justice facility. And then, of course, my brother dies. And now I really have to test my own theory. And I write my way through grief and loss in writing my book. Was the experience of writing your story, did things come up for you? Was it therapeutic? Talk to us about writing Celebration of Sisters.
Okay, so it was a culmination. So I started writing for Open to Hope some articles. And
I started with them too, ironically, when I saw that you wrote for Open to Hope. I love Open to Hope. Anyway, go ahead.
They're fabulous. Yeah, they're a wonderful, wonderful organization. So I first wrote the first article for the Centering Corporation, and I'm not a writer. Like, what do I know? Like, who's going to want to read? And after so many years of putting up a wall and not sharing anything with anybody, writing was sort of safe for me to kind of just unlock things in my head. And I'm a real introvert, and I kind of need to think things through. I can't just spew out an answer. I need time to think and process. So writing gave me that opportunity to kind of think and write things down. So Open to Hope kind of gave me baby steps to get started. And then, people have said to me for years, you should share your story. And I'm like, no. And I'm a very private person, and I didn't want to share my story. And I started writing it because I wanted people to know who Margie and Jane were, and to share my story and hopefully help somebody else so they're not alone with their grief. And parts of it, sharing their deaths and writing them, were very, very hard. And I had to stop and take a break and go skating or go for a walk and take a break, because it was very, very, very emotionally challenging to write those parts of the book.
Oh, yes, I'm right there with you.
But the gift was that because of the comment that somebody said to me that I was going to forget my sisters, and that because of the traumas and everything, so many memories are lost. The writing, a lot of memories did come back, and that was the greatest gift.
Do you feel like it helped you? Was it a therapeutic process for you to write this book?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. So now talk to us about this amazing thing you've done with the skating piece. I love this part of the story because it's something that the three of you shared, and how this idea dawned on you to start this annual event. Can you talk to us about that?
So the three of us took skating lessons. So Margie was like the real skater, and Jane and I sort of, kind of punted. And, Margie had the skating dress that didn't cover her rear end, and mine was like down to my knees because I was the chubette, and we just kind of did our thing. So I kept skating like off and on and off and on. And, philanthropy has always been important in our family. So I wanted to do something to honor them, have some sort of a fundraiser. And, there's walks, and I didn't want to have a boring chicken dinner or whatever. So my sisters were fun. So I was going to have like a dance thing or whatever. And then I thought, why don't we do a skating, a fundraiser? And I think in the back of my mind, the skating was always like pulling me towards them because it's something that the three of us all did. Like we were very, very different, like Jane and I were polar opposites, and Margie, we were all different, but skating was something that we all did. So skating was sort of the thread that kept me all together. So in 2011, I started it, and we started with 10 skaters and 50 people in the audience. And now it was going to be the grand finale last year, but it's not. I'm going to continue it. I could not do it. We had 92 skaters, and we had people via hybrid and people live, and we've raised close to $80,000 for Mass General Hospital. So it's been a very good thing.
Congratulations. That's pretty impressive. So for Mass General, is it just for Mass General?
It was for the primary care, but now we've switched it over to the eating disorder
That's
center.
what I was getting at. Yes. Which is even.
So this year we're going to just have an open skate and let people come and skate and do a few exhibitions. So it won't be such a big show.
Well, and I'm sure it takes up all of your time, right? I mean, if you're going to do an annual event, you're probably working on it all year long.
Exactly. And I used to perform. So at 65, I'm going to retire from performing.
You're 65?
I'm 65.
Oh my God. Well,
I'm still skating, but I'm not going to perform.
Well, for listeners who can't see, you don't look it. Oh my God, I would never guess that in a million years. So what do you, I guess, I mean, I think that what has touched me so deeply about your story is a couple of things. One, that you lost there was three of you lost two sisters, and just the magnitude of trying to understand and wrap my mind around that is one piece. The second is that I hate to call it a delay, but I don't know how else to talk about this idea of grief, where we can, as human beings, we use different language for it, compartmentalize it down, stuff things into we hear the saying, oh, we don't want to rip the lid off Pandora's box, because God knows what's going to fly out. And I've heard this about grief, though, that we as human beings, we have the ability to do this compartmentalizing. But one thing I've always said, that at some point, grief will bubble up if it is not dealt with in some way. It can show up physically in some physical manifestation. It's there. It doesn't go away, I guess, is my point. And so what I'd love for you to talk about with our listeners is, because it does sound like you compartmentalized and you had this very busy life, and then you were a single mom, and single moms out there know what that looks like, right? You are just trying to do your life and manage your life and your children's life and do all the things. But did you notice a difference with yourself after you did grief work? And I don't have any examples. I'm just curious. Did things change for you in any way?
It was very hard, I think, to realize that taking care of myself isn't being selfish. I think that was the biggest change.
Well, one of my last questions is always around self-love, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I want to ask you, throughout our conversation, is there anything that you really want listeners to know that I didn't ask, or anything that you feel would be helpful to them in their own grief journey, or in supporting others who are grieving?
Well, I think it's just giving yourself permission to feel whatever you want to feel, and I guess I didn't allow myself that permission, and there's no roadmap for grief. And it's just, you have one other person that you can talk to about, then it just helps so much. And just, there's no recipe, and everybody's journey is unique, and hopefully that you're not alone. And that would be my biggest advice to anybody. And like you say in your book, that grief and joy are wedded. And I think that how I said I I felt different going back to work. I had that experience when my first grandchild was born, and I went back on the ice, and my legs were all shaking, and I couldn't imagine why. It's because that grief changed me, and also this birth of this beautiful grandchild changed me.
Yeah, really beautifully put. You talked about self-care. It's a question I always ask at the very, very end of my podcast is what does self-love look like now? And the listeners who don't understand why I ask that question, I think that when we do deep grief work, I think we understand at a much deeper level the true fragility of life and what a gift it actually is to be alive, because it is not a given. No day is a given. And so I think about the way I changed what self-love meant to me after my brother's death. And so I'm going to ask you, how did it change the way you think about self-love and self-care?
I think it's a different kind of appreciation, and it's the gift of time, and that taking care of myself and deciding what's important and who I want to be with, and letting some of the not so important stuff go. And also speaking up when people say things that maybe I would have just let hurt me, and letting them know that that's not okay.
Using your voice.
Yes.
Boundaries. I talk about that all the time in my work. Boundaries are the most tangible way to practice self-love.
Right. And appreciating, the family that we do have left.
Now, is your mom still living?
Yes.
Okay, so where can people find you?
They can get me on my website at www.judylipson.org, or my author page, Judy A. Lipson, on Facebook, or Instagram at CELB of Sisters.
And we'll have all of those links in the show notes. Judy, thank you so much I felt like a kindred spirits in reading your memoir. And I want to thank you for coming on and for sharing your story, both with us today, but in your book. And I highly recommend it to listeners. It is a beautiful story. And as I said earlier, Judy really shares with an open heart her process. So I encourage you all to grab a copy, and we'll have a link to that as well. So thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate what you're doing in the world to help people, to help educate, but also in sharing your stories. I think it always gives permission to other people to speak more openly about their own journey. So thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for sharing Rocky with us too.
And thank you to all of my listeners for tuning in. And again, you guys, if you've got a story of your own grief journey, please share it with us. All right. Bye for now.